afternoon. Thank you very much for coming out tonight to listen to me talk about this book, which is kind of cool. All right, so we're here to talk about, I better look at the title because sometimes I forget, Women's American Football, Breaking Barriers on and Off the Field. I got it in one. All right. So mostly what we're going to talk about, since this is Phi Beta Delta, is the research that I did outside the United States. There's Dr. Laughlin, the representative for Phi Beta Delta, and Dr. Waters, on time as usual. Easy laugh, like, come on, make me work for you. All right, so anyway, Women's American Football, Breaking Barriers on and off the field, just became live yesterday on Amazon. You can order it through the University of Nebraska website, University of Nebraska Press. Go Huskers. There you go. All right. And so this is the culmination of a process that took, about 6 years, both for research and writing. So the world of women's football is a large one. Now, how many of you knew that women played football before right now? Most of you did, because most of you heard me talk about it. Right? But how many knew before I ever heard me talk about it? Okay, a few of you did. And I think, do we have the student here whose mother played football? One of the students in one of my classes had a mother who played football. So you notice the map is a bit distended there because I just stretched it to make it fit on the slide. I'm not trying to overturn geography here. But you'll see in the United States, there are teams all over. In Europe, there are quite a few teams. There are even teams in Africa, in places like Morocco and in Egypt, where being a woman engaged in sport is not all that easy. Not as easy, certainly, as it is here. So the research I did for this book was mostly the United States. So there are, probably around, there's your cue, I think somebody wants in. There are teams, let's see, where was it? There are around 100 teams playing tackle football in the United States. Somebody, oh no, it's telling me, all right, I have to do that from time to time. Sorry. Digressing. So there are teams all over the United States. You'll notice here in the middle of the country, Nebraska Nighthawks, Huskers. So the research I did, I talked to around 260 women from around 30 countries. And that's, around, I didn't count each and every one of them, but it's somewhere around maybe 265 people. About 5 guys I talked to who are coaches or league officials or something like that. So this has been a long project. Spent a lot of time talking to people who play football and love playing football. I talked to women from Europe. The first woman I talked to from outside the country was a woman named, Dr. I'm going to forget her name. Katie, and it will come to me in a moment, but she's from Great Britain. I've talked to several women from France, sometimes with my wife Sophie helping me translate because my French is frankly not that good. And I've talked to women from Russia, mostly who speak good English. I've talked to the women from Africa, a few from Morocco. Also from Australians, there are several teams there. And from South America, I don't see it on there. There should be one in Colombia. I had Dr. Laughlin and his wife Daisy helping me with the translation on that one because she didn't speak English and my Spanish is not that good either. So, the first women's football game I saw was in 2016 in, let's see, I'm probably going to mispronounce this, sorry, pardon my French, Agnières-sur-Seine. It's a northern suburb of Paris. I watched the Molas Bulldogs somebody mentioned in one of my classes there are a lot of team named Bulldogs, and that's true, against the Argo Canes, the combination of Argonauts and Hurricanes from the south of France, who played each other in the Challenge Feminine of the Fédération Française de Football Américain, the championship of the women's division for American football. And you see here, when I went to the game, I went with my friend Jean-Marc, who is a photographer, and he had a camera with a long lens on it. And so obviously the owner of the team thought that meant he was the press. And so he gave us press passes. Since I was with him, I was the press too. So it's the first time I got to be a reporter. So we got to stand on the sideline, that's about it, and we talked to some players after the game. Then I looked this up for Sport in American History, named it the Son of Austerlitz, shown on the Molosse. And that refers to the 1805 Battle of Austerlitz. Look it up afterwards. And this all became, the reason I went to this game was because when I wrote Le Football, the history of American football in France, I found the Sparkle de Villeneuve Saint-Georges, who was the first women's team in France. And they, at the time I wrote this, they played an exhibition game against Spain, which they lost. They played a couple of regular season games against other French teams that they had won. And so I knew women's football existed about the same way that I knew American football existed in France before I met Jean-Marc, who, when we were at a dinner party, left the room and came back in wearing a football helmet. And I said, well, they play football in France, and apparently they do. And you can read all about it. So when I came home, I then went to watch the Columbus Comets. They have since folded up shop, and now they're the Columbus Chaos. But I watched them play, and the Argo Canes versus the Molosse, which the Molosse won, was a fairly decent game. The game I saw, the Comets versus the Derby City Dynamite from Louisville, was not so good. Derby City at that time had maybe 20 players, and just before halftime, one of them got hurt badly enough to need an ambulance. And so the game was stretching on into the wee hours of the morning, and I had to drive home, so I left. But since that time, I've seen quite a few games in various places, and I've seen some pretty good football. I've seen all four of Ohio's teams, the Columbus Comets, the Cincinnati Sizzle, the Cleveland Fusion, and the Toledo Rain. I've seen all of those play at various times, sometimes in the playoffs, sometimes in the regular season. The first time I went outside the country, which of course Phi Beta Delta is about, it's the honorary for international scholars, was to go to a game in Langley, British Columbia, Canada. This was the International Federation of American Football's Women's World Championship in 2017. This was the third time IFAF, International Federation of American Football, had held this event, and it was also the third time that the United States dominated. They had won all three at this point because, we had the most women playing football, and also, as I've mentioned before, Americans grow up absorbing football, watching it. Let's see, we had 2 days of the week, 1 day of the week, Wednesday, tonight. That's why we had this tonight, because it's, there's no other football on. I guess there's a World Series or something like that. But we can watch football almost every night of the week, and that's like watching game film. So I went to Langley, British Columbia, and to get in to the games there, I talked to a guy with the American Football International. It's a website, and he offered to get me a press pass. They had written an article on my French football book, and so they knew of me, and so they got me a press pass. So I, was again a member of the press corps. I sort of felt, what do they call it, imposter syndrome, until I tried to watch the Australians practice, and Dr. Jen Welders, who was the first woman to coach in the NFL, sent an assistant coach. She was the head coach of the Australian team. She sent an assistant coach over to run me off. So this is a closed practice. So after that, I felt like a reporter. I was being abused by coaches. That's a small thing, but there you go. This game on screen here is Mexico versus Australia. And Australia had a hard time. They still, let's see, they won one recently, so they've broken that barrier. But the Mexican team were the surprise of this tournament. It was the first time they had been in the Women's World Championship, and they ended up finishing in third place. The top two spots were the United States and Canada, of course. Second foray into international stuff took place in Indiana, which is sort of foreign. Anybody from Indiana? Sorry. Sorry about that. Oh, this video is going to be in trouble. All right, so I went to Mooresville, which is a suburb of Indianapolis, to watch the Manitoba Girls Football Association team play against the Indiana Girls Tackle Football League. These were middle school and high school girls playing football. The Manitoba team was from Manitoba and Canada, and so they had this Battle of the Borders contest. The fourth and fifth grade game, well, fourth through sixth, I suppose, was pretty close because the Canadian girls didn't have that much more experience than the Americans, but the high school game was pretty much a runaway for Canada. So they had much more experience than their American counterparts. This was one of the first leagues, I think it was 2012, when they started playing. So they had several years of experience. Then I went to Metairie, Louisiana. This is, if you notice here, it looks like the Saints back there. It's the Saints practice facility in Metairie. And this was the site of the Women's World Football Games, that USA Football at one time held to try to bring the world closer to the United States in terms of football ability. They held this program. They brought in women from around the world and from the United States to learn from American coaches. And so you can see here, maybe a little bit difficult to see, but the helmets here, this is Germany, that's France. Boy, I had to use my phone to look up some of these flags. I think that's Norway, Italy, not sure, and various other countries. So there are women from about 14 or 15 countries at this, in addition to the Americans. I think I interviewed 30 of the women at that event. Next up on the road trip was Las Vegas, Nevada. It was about 105 degrees. Of course, it was a dry heat, as they say, but it was still hot. The teams didn't seem to have much trouble playing in it, though. This was the so-called Best of the West Championship. A number of teams decided to drop out of the Independent Women's Football League and go off and do their own thing. The Texas Elite Spartans defeated the Utah Falcons in this game. But it was a good game, a very close game. And that's something that women's football sometimes suffers from, is lopsided scores. They don't have all that great a competitive balance sometimes. But this was a great game. It came down to the last play of the game. And I enjoyed watching that and sweating in the heat. Didn't gamble at all. If you've ever been to Vegas, I suppose that's something people do, but didn't interest me at all. Then, in August of 2022, just a few months ago, I was in Vantaa, Finland, We have the dean here, and thank you for helping with funding that. All right. And so, again, got a press pass. Gotta love that. And this time no one threw me out of any place. So, you know, that is old hat by now. This is a game between, let's see, this is Norway and Finland. All right, two of the teams in the Women's World Championship. Again, this was the International Federation of American Football Women's World Championship. In this one, the world is starting to catch up to the United States. In our first game, we beat Germany 52-0, which was pretty good. But when you consider the last time we played the Germans in 2013, it was on the 4th of July, and the Germans, for the first time ever, scored a touchdown against us, and it really made us angry, and we scored 100 straight points on them. So 52-0 is not bad, given that history. But in the second game, the Finns were tied with us at halftime, which was unheard of. We pulled away because we had better depth than they did and won the game, but still, it was a bit unusual. And then in the third game, the British team were actually ahead of us for a little while. The British had beaten the Canadians, who had finished second in every Women's World Championship. So the British caught up and defeated the Canadians, and then were ahead of us for a bit in the final game. And then, of course, we proved that God's on the side of the big battalions, as Voltaire said, and we defeated them. But still, it's getting closer and closer. It'll be interesting to see the next time. So on September 22nd, I finally got the book. Like I said, this was about a 6-year process. The first probably 4 years were doing the research for this, interviewing the women, which continued while I wrote the book as well. But then it took about a year to write this up. I think I wasted some time while I was on sabbatical putting together a research page where I had everything in one place, and then hardly looked at it afterwards. But it took about a year to finish the writing, and then another year to find someone to publish it. Thankfully, the University of Nebraska Press came through, Go Huskers. And they did a great job on the cover. If you noticed when I showed you my book on French football, also published by the Nebraska Press, Go Huskers, that was a really great cover with the Eiffel Tower and a football flying by and all that sort of thing. The first cover they gave me, suggestion they gave me, had Australian teams on it, which I didn't think, I mentioned they were Australian, so they found another one. The player on the cover here is Grace Cooper, who had been a player for the Minnesota Vixen, and a running back who has rushed for somewhere over 3,000 yards in the last 3 years. Well, 5 years minus the COVID time. So she's a very good running back. I talked to her about a week ago. She said she likes this picture. She uses it. She teaches physical education in a small school, and she uses it to tell her students, I can be mean. So they pretty much stay in line. So the contents of the book, first chapter, is on the beginnings of women's professional football. I call it professional, but it's actually semi-professional, because the players, for the most part, after these first leagues, have to buy their own equipment. They also have to pay a fee to the team each year. That can range from, a few hundred to almost $1,000. So you have to really want to play women's football to be on one of these teams. So mostly I wrote about, in the first chapter, the Toledo Troopers, one of the greatest semi-professional or professional women's football teams of all time, and you can make the argument one of the best professional football teams of all time because they won, I think, 7 straight championships. Their ace running back, Linda Jefferson, ran for about 7,000 yards and scored more touchdowns, I believe, than Jim Brown in the professional ranks. So after this league folded, it was about 10 years, 15 years, something like that, before women's football came back. A couple of promoters decided to host or sponsor a barnstorming tour between the Minnesota Vixen and the Lake Michigan Minks. The names are so-so. But that evolved into several leagues and hundreds of women, probably thousands of women at the height playing football on these leagues. Now, leagues come and go in women's football, and eventually the league started by these two promoters folded, and the Independence Women's Football League became the premier league in the United States. They sent I think all of the players to the 2010 Women's World Championship. But just as I was finishing the writing of this book, this league folded because they lost a lawsuit and had a $10,000 award against them. And so there was no way they were going to pay that, so they folded. The Women's Football Alliance had been challenging them already and had taken over as the premier women's football league with around 60 teams around the country. And in the 2017 Women's World Championship, I think they sent about 45 of the women on the 52-player roster, plus some Canadians, some Australians, some Brits to go on to play. Now, just as they were starting to play in the Women's Football Alliance, they had a new competition from the Lingerie Football League, or the Legends Football League, or now the X. This was women playing in not much clothes at all, which was, generally speaking, the league that got the most press. Most of it bad, but still the most press. After the Best of the West tournament, the Women's National Football Conference incorporated the 4 teams that were in the Best of the West series: the Utah Falcons, the Texas Elite Spartans, the San Diego Surge, and the Seattle Majestics. And so they formed the Women's National Football Conference. That's the youngest league, and of course they've been around for 3 years plus 2 years when they didn't play much because of COVID. But they've been successful at gaining sponsorships. Adidas sponsors them, for instance. And so they're making some strides moving towards a model where the players don't have to pay to play, they can get paid to play. The next chapter was about the girls' football leagues, starting in Manitoba, then in New Brunswick in Canada, then in Utah, in Salt Lake City, and finally in Indianapolis. The Indiana Girls Tackle Football League is no longer around. It started when a daughter of a guy wanted to play football, and her parents said no, but the father then decided to start this league. I think once she graduated, he probably just let it go. Then finally, there's a postscript. During the pandemic, when there were no sports, no live sports on television, ESPN ran a documentary called Born to Play on ESPN in prime time, which was a big step forward for women's football. And the Women's Football Alliance has started getting sponsors as well. And they also, their last championship, which they started 2 years ago playing at Tom Benson Hall of Fame Field in Canton, was televised on ESPN2. So they had their games on ESPN3, which is just a streaming service, but now it's on live television. So they've made some strides. Since I started working on this project, women's football has come a considerable way. They have started getting more attention and in some ways more money. And so maybe the cost of playing for these women is starting to go down. So I also talked to ONU grads, two of them who played football. In, let's see, chapter 5, Bridget McDonald, who was a rugby player here at ONU, didn't graduate, but she went off and played for the Chicago Bliss of the then Legends Football League. Also, Jenna Mitchell, who was a history major, went off when she was in middle school, played for Baker Middle School in Marion. So we had two ONU students who had played football before, which was kind of cool, and I made sure they got in the book, because why not? So what's next? Next October, there is going to be the Transatlantic Trophy 2. The first Transatlantic Trophy was just before the pandemic. The New York Sharks went to, let's see, I think it was held in Finland, played the Helsinki Wolverines and the Birmingham Lions of British women's football. I think there was another Finnish team as well. So this one's going to include, let's see, the Washington Prodigy, which was a very successful team, has been, the Helsinki Wolverines, the New York Wolves, that was a successor team to the Sharks, the Tampa Bay Inferno. I've actually seen them play a couple of times when I was down in Tampa scoring AP US history exams. I always found the time to go out and watch that because, frankly, it was better than scoring AP history exams. The Birmingham Lions and the Stuttgart Scorpions from Germany. So, in 2023, that's where I plan to be. Now, when I convinced when the University of Nebraska Press decided to publish my book, they said, well, you're going to have to cut 60,000 words out of it, which is quite a bit. So I ended up cutting almost all of the international part. And so since that time, I've been to Finland for the Women's World Championship. And so I'm starting to collect information on the international game and trying to, hopefully this one will sell. Makes a good Christmas present. And so hopefully I'll find someone interested in publishing volume 2 of this. All right, that's it. I'm not going to take long here tonight. Are there any questions? Yes.
What state has the best football players? And which state produces the best women's football?
Well, that's a good question. There are two leagues. The Boston Renegades have won 4 championships in a row, and they've had a long history of winning other championships under other team names. But then you have in the Women's National, that's in the Women's Football Alliance, in the Women's National Football Conference, the Texas Elite Spartans have won 4 championships in a row. But the leagues don't talk to each other, so there's no Super Bowl, although there used to be one by that name, until the NFL got all mad about it and threatened to sue. That also happened to the Women's National Football League. Too close, they said. So either Texas or Massachusetts. Other questions? Yes?
Are the teams from Ohio good?
Are the teams from Ohio good?
Yes.
Columbus has been to the playoffs before, but now they're a new team under the name of Chaos instead of the Comets. The Toledo Reign, they were in the playoffs a few years ago. I'm not sure that the Reign have come back yet from the pandemic. They didn't play for the last 2 years once play resumed. The Cleveland Fusion has been to a championship in the past, and the Cincinnati Sizzle, not so much. They were once owned by Icky Woods, if you know who Icky Woods is. I'm not going to do the Icky Shuffle, it hurt myself. So at times they're good, but not recently. Yeah.
What made you want to like write specifically about this topic?
Because nobody else does it. You know, if you want to write a history, if you're writing about the Civil War, for instance, everybody writes about the Civil War or World War II. When I decided to write about French football, there was nothing on it. And so I had a niche set out for me. And the same thing with women's football. There was a women's football encyclopedia published by a guy named Neil Rosendahl. So there had been something, but there wasn't much about it. So it's finding a niche, an academic niche.
So what's the moral of the story? What's the punchline? What is your conclusion after all this research and visiting and talking? Mm-hmm. Is there a conclusion?
These women, let's see, what did H. Rap Brown say? Violence, it's as American as apple pie, something like that. They love the violence. They love hitting, being hit, mostly hitting, of course. And I think one of the biggest surprises, I suppose, I found in this project was, if we're to believe our popular culture, then there's always going to be some guy standing in the way of these women playing football. And I found nothing of the sort. Several of the players told me that they had found out about the women's football teams in their area because their mother had seen an advertisement and sent it to them, you know, or their fathers. So that was probably the biggest takeaway I found. Others? Again?
What country in Europe produces the best players?
So far, the British. They finished second in the world in 2022. The Finns are also very good. Unfortunately, in this last Women's World Championship, the Mexicans, I did find there is some resistance, or at least some incompetence in the case of the Mexican team. The Mexican team were probably favorites to get at least third, if not second, but their federation somehow didn't tell them that they didn't have any money to buy airplane tickets. So these women showed up at the airport and there were no tickets for them. The Mexicans, as I said, in 2017 were the surprise of the championship. And the Mexican team beat the United States in the World Games this last summer. I suppose I should have put that on there. I also went to Birmingham, Alabama, which is a garden spot. A lot of trees. But they did pay to have their women's team win a championship in the World Games. But when the women showed up at the airport, there were no tickets. So it took them a couple of days. They had to forfeit their first game against Great Britain, but they eventually showed up and won their next two games in convincing fashion. So that's sort of there is some resistance to women's football, but it usually comes from federations. And it's generally not that we don't want you to play, it's that we don't have all that money to give to you. Other questions? Yes?
How does the style of play compare to what we might do? So I've never seen a women's football game. How does it compare to what I might be used to seeing the college or pro level?
Pretty much the same. They use NFL rules, and probably it would be more like football in the 1950s and 60s, more 3 yards in a cloud of dust than it is passing. Although some teams, such as the best teams, such as the Boston Renegades and the Texas League Spartans, have good quarterbacks and they have good aerial attack. But it's more ground and pound than it is throwing the ball. Although there's some pretty good quarterbacks. Other questions? Aren't you past your limit?
No, I have no limit. I hold this department like cats. The teams are obviously all women. Is the organizational structure that holds like the coaches and stuff, is that all women or are there other men?
Most of the owners are women, former players, in fact. A lot of the ownership of these women's teams basically stepped forward when no one else was going to come up with any money. And so they bought the teams. The coaching staffs are still largely male, although in the Women's World Championship, our head coach was the Cleveland Browns' own Callie Brownson, who's an assistant coach for the Browns. She had 4 other women coaches as assistants, and so that's starting to change, but fairly slowly. USA Football, as part of the Women's World Games, not only taught women the finer points of football, but they also had coaching clinics. And the woman in charge of that later on went to the NFL and started hosting a career forum for women. And so there have been now probably around 20 women from the playing ranks who have coached in the NFL. Brownson is one of the full-time coaches. Let's see. I'm trying to think of the coach for the San Francisco 49ers. Her name is escaping me right now, unfortunately. It'll come to me. But there are more and more women in the NFL coaching ranks. So really they're kind of skipping over coaching in the Women's Football Alliance or the Women's National Football Conference and coaching in the NFL, which of course pays better.
Katie Sowers?
Katie Sowers, thank you. You're still my external brain pad, Jared. Yes?
Interestingly, just today I had a student come in after football practice yesterday. He came in with a concussion this morning. And I was just wondering, do the ladies playing football, do they suffer injuries comparable to male football players? And do they know the long-term consequences that are happening among high school, college, and professional players in terms of dementia that seems to be connected to football injuries going way, way back to junior high school?
Yes. Yes, they do suffer injuries, probably at a higher level. There's research that indicates that women tend to suffer concussions and other injuries at a higher rate than men. In the high school ranks, of course, football is first in the number of concussions, but girls soccer is second because of the head. And they know the long-term consequences, and like many men, ignore them. I talked to a girl who was probably 14 or 15 with the Utah Girls Football League, and she was telling me, yeah, last year I broke my collarbone in a game, but I didn't tell the coaches because I didn't want to sit. And so she played through it. And that's something, of course, we used to celebrate. You play through the pain. Now we see some of the consequences of that, especially the head injuries. But I suppose the way I wrote it in the book was that the freedom that American women have to play football means the freedom to also put their lives at risk. And there's a lot of them who want to do that. Others? A lot of questions.
I'm done.
Okay, go ahead. Other questions? Yes?
Are these mostly like high school, middle schoolers that are playing, or adults?
Adults. Now, the one chapter is about the high schoolers and middle schoolers playing in Utah and Manitoba, in New Brunswick, and there are a few other startup leagues now. But for the most part, most of these women are in their 30s, which does lead to probably more injury, being prone to more injuries, because, as you know, once you're out of high school, your body stops recovering so quickly. I notice mine has. And that means, you know, not necessarily more head injuries, but more ankle, knee, shoulder, etc. The woman who owns the Toledo Reign played for several years with on a knee that had no cartilage left in it. She had no idea. She just knew that doesn't feel good, but I'm going to play through the pain. So finally, she got that diagnosed, and they found a donor body, and she got some cartilage put back in her knee.
Is there a draft for scouting, or is it all simply come in and try out?
It's starting to get, there's starting to be more of the scouting and not drafting as such, but enticing players. They're starting to do something like the transfer portal in college football. So players are starting to flock to teams like Boston and Texas. The Renegades last year, I saw them play in Canton, had one player from Great Britain as a running back, and they had 2 players from Finland, one a running back and one a wide receiver. And they had another one, a quarterback from Australia. So there's sort of a, if you ever seen the old movie, The Sisterhood of Traveling Pants, I never saw it, but I liked the name.